This is House Planning Help, episode 241. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. And today we're looking at 10 tips for better budgeting on your self-build. Into that in a moment. First though, it's been a while since they've let me out. Now that I've got a house, I'm never ever leaving. The last couple of years, what with designing a house and constructing it, it's not been so easy to get out to conferences. So it's really good. I'm trying to make sure this year I go to as many as I possibly can. First one coming up, hosted by the ASBP. And I've been to this before. It's their Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo. Very good. This year, focusing on plastics in construction. So no doubt I will come back having learned a heap and maybe having eyed up some more interviewees. We shall see. So it's a regular thing each year they host this, and that's why we mention all the great organisations as and when we can. I'm well aware that quite a lot of you will listen to this after the date it's gone by. However, just check out their website. No doubt they will be organising something else that is great. So let's get to this solo episode today on budgeting. I mentioned at the start of the year how it's going to be a big theme across the year, looking at costs. And I quite enjoy now, in hindsight, being able to look back, doing a couple of things. First of all, delving into the archive and trying to tie together some loose ends for you, assuming you're about to go through this. And also looking at some other resources and picking information out, which I think, well, that would have been really helpful. Had I seen that first time round? So that's what today's episode is, an amalgamation of different information. I'll flag it up when we move on to other people's information, but most of it is from House Planning Help. And we start with this tip here about starter budget. I always start with a dummy tip, don't I? Starter budget. Apparently some people don't really do that. They just let things drift or buy things as they go along. So this is not just starter budget as our first tip. This is starter budget and keep fine tuning. Budgets don't stand still. And in those early days, in fact, we'll talk about this in a moment, really they're a little bit of guesswork. So you haven't got planning permission or anything like that. So you have got to do that. However, the closer you get to construction, hopefully the detail is really there. And I mean really there, all encompassing. It'd be lovely to think when you start construction that actually everything is there. However, I imagine there'll be a few things. We had a couple of PC sums that were allocated to certain things. These are provisional amounts, and that can be challenging. I remember some of the sums were for bathrooms in our case, and we discovered for the spec that we were wanting, perhaps they were a little bit on the low end, not massively, but that led to actually a very useful, happy decision for me, which was actually to turn one of our bathrooms into a storage room. So it could be converted into a bathroom because it's all set up to go. However, it's a storeroom, and I love that storeroom. Really do. Don't want attic space. Don't want to be climbing up ladders. Build a storeroom into your house. Anyway, that's not today's episode. So that's your first tip about fine tuning. I'm actually going to look at my budget right now. So if I get it up on the computer here, oh yes, it's color coded. It has things like, because we went down a traditional tender route, it refers back to which part of the contract we're talking about, the clause, also the room, where are we talking about in the house, whose responsibility is it, the trade, the work items. So all of these things have got to be allocated. So just going back to trade, it might be electrical, carpenter, the flooring provider, decorator, whoever else it might be. Our responsibility if it's buying items for each room. Works item, supplier, contractor, the quantity, and the actual spec. And one thing, I don't know that many people do this, but for certain things, we actually provide a little picture in our budget. That wasn't me. You know that's my wife, don't you? Yeah, she is the organised one. And it looks very good because then you can scan down to what you want. Mainly that's for furnishings, though, I shall say as well. Let's move on to tip number 2. And being in those early stages, how exactly do you define what the budget is? So we know a little bit about this. You can obviously count the pennies in your pocket. What assets do I have? How much can I borrow? I'm talking about after that. So you're looking at potential sites that you're going to develop. You're also looking at how big do I want this house to be? And it's a little bit unfair because when you look at these sites, really you've got to build to the value of properties in that area. So it's then a case of working backwards. That's a good tip. So you start with Rightmove is my favorite. Check out what's the value of the house next door and so on down the street, and you'll work out there's a rough ceiling value for that. Maybe you can have a look at how big those houses are. So if you're going to be able to afford in this area, you've got a floor area-ish that you can then multiply by build cost. And we say cost tables. The magazines are very good at this. I think they realize it's something that people want to get their hands on, the cost tables. I know that Mark Brinkley in his book, The House Builder's Bible, has all sorts of tables as well. But they're very good for coming up with that figure. Now, you've got to work out a few other things. It's not just saying, right, away you go. What quality are you going for? In my case, trying to build a passive house standard is going to add a little bit as well. And how are you going to do this? Are you going to do what I did? Are you going to take things into your own hands? We talked a little bit about this in the last episode as well, different build routes and what you're going to go down to. So these are things that you need to sort out in those early days. And it's all quite scary because you don't really want to commit yourself to a piece of land unless you know you're going to get planning permission for the size of house and the type of house that you want. And, so you've got to play out all these things. And I know we've had situations in my research. I was listening back to Tara and Dimitri, who were building in Gloucestershire, and they, I think, had spent something like £20,000 before they'd even bought the piece of land. So although they said, yes, we will buy this piece of land, the owner of the plot could have backed out at any moment saying, actually, I don't want to sell this to you. Luckily, that didn't happen, but it shows the level of commitment when you're not 100% sure of what you're doing. I think they went down a design and build route, which is quite a cost-effective way once you've found that good builder to work with. So start with those tables, work out all those variables. That's my second tip. Budget for the completed home, not a house build. And I've got a big issue with this because when I came in, I didn't really understand this. I just took the cost of building a house to mean, well, that's what it's going to cost. Not really. No, there are thousands of other things. Have you thought about curtains? Have you thought about the furniture you're going to have in the house? Have you thought about the garden landscaping, the paving, all of these things, which perhaps if you're asking an expert, they just assume you know. They even talk about the build cost. You don't know. You're coming into this cold. Fees on top of that. What are your architecture or designer going to charge as well? So think about that. That's where this fluid approach of the budget, you're not going to get it all right on day one, but you must keep refining it. Keep thinking, what have I forgotten? Go around as the designs are created, go around all the rooms. What do I have to have? If you're working with a designer and they're doing all the technical design, a lot of that legwork is done for you. And then you go out to tender and their various different contractors will price up what they would do it for. This is another one that is oh so important. It's interesting as well, looking through house planning help interviews and realizing a lot of people suggest different numbers for a contingency. So I'm just going with set a contingency. When you run out of money, have to bring things to a halt, that probably means either you've just very quickly spent your contingency or you were going into this a little bit blind. So I'm going to go for the around about 10% mark, but I've heard some people say if you price it up well, 5%-ish can be good. If you're not so confident, that's the other thing. If you bring skills to the table, if you're a good project manager, if you're working with professionals, they should be able to help you as well. Then all of those things should mean that you don't go into the contingency. However, of course, there are unknowns. We say about the ground, don't they? If you're building new above ground, generally you should be able to nail down these things, but there are always little things that you haven't thought of. So set that contingency, make it real, put it to one side. Don't spend it. It will be tempting. I know, just thinking of, that one more thing that I would really like. Number 5 then, we're halfway through already. Use a quantity surveyor. When you're dealing with consultants, I know you're dealing with rising costs. So perhaps there is someone else in the team who can provide you with definitive costs. If not, then this is the situation to get a quantity surveyor involved. It is their job, and that's why, yes, you're going to have to pay them a fair bit of money for it, but their experience, they've done this lots of times before, and it's just going to help bring a degree of certainty to your project. I know what it's like, because you couldn't just keep on going, hiring all sorts of consultants, crazy ones, the acoustic consultant, whatever it might be. You have got to draw a line somewhere. But really, how much of a priority is this to hit your budget. Only you know that in your given situation. If you need to hit your budget, it needs to be fairly high up. No, I'm going to scrub that out. It needs to be at the top of your priorities of how things work. And we've got a few other tips of things that might help you along the way. Number 6, don't overspend in your early days. If you followed my other tips, well, you won't end up here. However, if you are just drifting through the process a little bit, oh, it's tempting, that piece of land, yeah, I'll just buy that. I know it's a bit more than I really put down on paper that I was going to afford, but it will be my dream piece of land. It's even got a view, do you know? Well, that's all very well, but you just have got to understand that you take from one area, then it's going to come out of the finishes of the house, because there are some bits that it's hard to squeeze it. That end stage, we had that chat with Adam Cohen quite recently, and he had his buckets mentality, that you've got certain buckets which actually you can't play around with them too much. It's the one at the end, the one where you're thinking about that kitchen and you can pay $5,000 for a kitchen, or 30,000, 40,000, you can go silly money. So finishes is one that you can play around with. Don't overspend in the early days, because it will just grow into a huge headache. Now, is this a budget tip? Invest in the fabric of the building. I think it is, because if you're at all worried that you haven't got the money to finish, how should you be approaching it? Not everyone agrees with this wholeheartedly. I would say that the fabric of the building is going to be hard to change. So things like all the insulation in the walls, the windows, those components, how you're finishing the building, you are going to see that for years to come. Whereas the kitchen that we talked about, I know you could view it as quite wasteful, that let's say you buy a cheap kitchen knowing that in 2 or 3 years' time you're going to rip it out and put something more expensive in. However, we've got to just look at realities here. And this is where there are some bits that are more important than others. Maybe you've got, it's funny because you do see the reverse situation every so often, where an architect will suggest to someone, well, let's make cutbacks. Why don't we reduce the amount of insulation in the wall or what have you? And, it's because it's not going to affect them, the bills that are going to pay, are they? If you're looking for cutbacks, that will still mean that they can have their fantastic design. So I would say just be careful here when you're budgeting. Fabric first is always a good idea, because that's the other thing. You're budgeting for living in that house too in the long term. You want those cheaper bills. And there's nothing more satisfying, trust me, as I sit smug in my passive house and go and feel the radiator. Oh, it's not on again. Oh, that's right, the sun's out. It's not saying it's warm outside, it's freezing, it's blowing a gale at the moment, yet it's massively helping us out. So build the house right in the first place. Set yourself up for budget success. Number 8. Don't be afraid to bring things to a halt. There's nothing worse than following the sunk cost fallacy. So you're underway, you've pumped in all this money. We talked about Tyra and Dimitri having shelled out 20 grand before they even bought the land. Well, let's say it's all collapsed and they discovered that they couldn't build for within the budget and they bought the piece of land or whatever it might be. You do have other options. You don't have to plow on regardless. You might sell that piece of land and actually be pleasantly surprised that it's gone up in value. That is one option. People are always looking for land. Or maybe you might change what you had in mind. So some flexibility here. For example, if you get to that stage that you think, oh my goodness, money's really tight, then the value engineering will help. Hopefully, as Nick Grant says, maybe we'll link across to him in these show notes as well, the value engineering is all done in those early days, so you're not going to get the big shock. But let's say it isn't, there will be opportunities to phase things. We had this as potential when we looked at our value engineering, for example, the garage. Do we need it right now? Well, if we've got a driveway, we can park the cars on the driveway. I don't want to do that, but we can do that. The balcony, really, do we need the balcony on day one? Actually, when we came to these decisions, we decided we just wanted to do it all in one go and we went for it. However, be flexible if you think you need to be. Don't get, we knew we could get to the end. If you think this is going to get sketchy somewhere, I'm not even sure where that point is, be careful. Number 9. So we're on to other tips here, and I found this one particularly interesting in regards to the designer or architect that you choose. They need to demonstrate to you they can stick to a budget, they can design to a budget as well, and if they can't, you don't have to pay for those plans. So I think what I quite like about this tip is that it works for the architects or designers too. You don't enter into that contract unless you're confident you can deliver. So as a client going to that architect or designer, if they say, well, I'm not going to sign up to that, well, you just move on to the next one. So it's not pressurizing anyone, but it allows you to work with people who are confident in their skills. The one thing I'm not so sure, this not being our own tip, is it ever unfair on architects or designers? I would hope that the majority of them go out in good faith, and it's a bit the same for them. They have to start with their designs, looking at your budget and thinking, well, what can you afford? They want you to hit your budget too. And I will say, perhaps I've seen the odd occasion where you wondered, what were they thinking of? Why are they designing that? This architects, it's generally with people with pots of money, funnily enough. You think that they would never run into issues, but the bigger the scale, sometimes that really gets nasty towards the end with fees and all the rest of it. So an interesting point. We might have to dig into that in the future, find out from a few architects if they have ever signed up to this or whether they've just said, that's not for us, go and visit the next one. And finally, in our list of 10, bank up your cost savings. So you will make savings as you go through. If you haven't pinned everything down, just don't spend them. Don't think, woohoo! Put it in with the contingency. Just have it sitting there. Don't be tempted to then just instantly make something else bigger, grander, up the specification of it. Leave it for the rainy day fund in the contingency. Let's recap our 10 tips. How did you find them today? Hopefully useful. Start that budget in the first place and keep fine tuning it. Point number 1. Point number 2, start with the cost tables. You can do this before you even go to planning. You're not going to be able to tie things down, and it's silly to as well. You might not even know how you're going to build the thing, but you can start with the cost tables and work out your build routes and all of those various different quality issues and so forth. Number 3, budget for the completed home, not just the house build. There are going to be lots of extras. Probably people won't tell you about them. You need to figure them out as well. Just think about your whole completed home, garden, garage, etc. Set a contingency. Don't skip it. Set the contingency. Number 5, use a quantity surveyor. This tip not for everyone. As I say, if you're confident you've nailed down all your costs, they're not going to move, then maybe don't use a quantity surveyor. 6, don't overspend in the early days. 7, invest in the fabric first. 8, don't be afraid to be a little bit flexible. Bring things to a halt. Pumping in money when you know you haven't got it is only going to end in tears. 9, choose architects who have a proven track record of building to specific budgets. Speak to former clients of theirs. Just make sure this is all above board, and hopefully if you sign up under that proviso, well, then you're onto a winner. And bank up your cost savings rather than just spending them. Check out the show notes for this episode at houseplanninghelp.com/241. And we'll probably have more episodes like this where there's a little research or some other slight flip on it that I want to do is maybe as I go around interviewing people, ask various different architects, builders, and so forth for an answer to a question. And then what we can do, I can then mold them through the magic of the podcast into one episode, and we'll get maybe a rounded picture. So that's something that I want to do with some of the podcasts this year. Okay, houseplanninghelp.com/241 to add anything that you think, perhaps there's some priority that I have missed. I'd love you to fill it in the show notes, please, for this episode. houseplanninghelp.com/241. Let's throw in an iTunes review. We love these. We haven't pushed them for a while, so please leave us a review. We'll read it out. This is from Beth's Podcast Thoughts. I like it. The handle even shows what she's thinking. The House Planning Help podcasts are an excellent source of information on every aspect of self-building and sustainable methods. The topics are covered at the right level, plenty of detail, and the important points without being overly technical. Accessible, useful, and comprehensive, they are an invaluable resource for your self-build project. Massive thank you, Beth. You can leave your iTunes review. If you're an iTunes subscriber, it's very, very simple. Search for the podcast in the store. click on ratings and reviews, and there it says write a review. Just a few words, don't feel it has to be an essay. Just give someone else an idea of what these podcasts are like, and that spreads the message, gets the love out there. Thank you so much. New content in the Hub this month. We're doing my in-depth video case study. So although I'm not making any new podcasts about my build, we're reliving it. Poor old Hub members. No, they're going that. So it's a masonry build. Maybe that's of interest. You're thinking of going down this route. Well, we're going to share exactly what happens, what I think of going down that approach. And the stage we're at the moment is preparing the strip foundations. And it was oh so wet. We had to have a pump on site. We'll look at some of the designs of the strip foundations and what it actually means. That's the video that's gone in this month. We look at how a site is prepared as well, because on day one, it's a field, theoretically, and then put up the Harris fencing, get the porta cabins in, the storage units, put a flat standing down for vehicles. You've got to set out the site. Where is the building going to go? All of that covered in this latest episode in the Hub, houseplanninghelp.com/join, along with all the regular stuff, the courses. We try and go step by step through certain topics. Also our conference calls where we grab an expert by the scruff of the neck and say, answer our questions. We want to know about X topic. Or in the community forum where we all can interact. It's a social thing, but also it's quite a good accountability area where you can have one thread for your own project, and anything that comes up, we can chip in information to try and help you, contacts and so forth. So houseplanninghelp.com/join. We'd love to help you in the Hub. That's your lot for another week. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.